If you have ever watched a man build something that made no sense to anyone else, you already know how quickly people decide what they think of it. In small settlements, especially with winter closing in, judgment comes fast. Not because people are cruel, but because they trust what has kept them alive. That was the case in the autumn of 1,906 inches, a narrow mountain settlement called Brass Hook, tucked along a cold stream in the northern Idaho high country. The cabins sat low in the valley, close to water, close to one another, built where the ground made life easier. No one built on the hillside. There was a reason for that. The wind struck harder up there, snow stacked deeper. Every load had to be carried uphill, every trip costing more than it gave back. Over time, the choice stopped being questioned. It became a rule. And like most rules that last long enough, it turned into something people no longer thought about at all. So when one man began hauling timber up that slope, cutting into ground no one trusted, building where no one lived, the town did not wait to understand it. They decided what it was: a mistake. And if you've ever seen something like that, something that didn't make sense at first but held something more, let me know where you're watching from. Stories like this tend to travel farther than the people in them ever did. And if you want to follow this journey to the end, stick around. Your support with a like and a subscription really helps. Because in a place like Brass Hook, a man didn't need to explain himself. He just needed to keep working. And that man was Vance Calder. He did not arrive with noise, no announcement, no story offered up at the store counter. Just a man who worked with his hands and looked at land longer than most men thought necessary. Vance Calder had spent years working alongside an Army field engineering unit, building shelters where the ground did not forgive mistakes. In those places, a wall set wrong or a roof set weak did not lead to inconvenience. It led to men not waking up. He carried that with him, though he never spoke of it in detail. What remained was not the past itself, but the habit it left behind. He did not choose ground because it was easy. He chose it because it would hold. While others saw comfort in the valley, Vance studied the slope above it. He watched how the wind crossed the ridge. He paid attention to the lines where trees leaned and where older growth had been broken long before anyone in Brass Hook had settled there. And then, without asking for agreement, he bought a narrow strip of land halfway up that hillside. Mara Calder, his wife, moved with him. She was carrying their first child, and by the time the first frost settled into the valley floor, her steps had already begun to slow. That alone was enough for most men to call the decision reckless. But Vance did not argue. He simply began measuring the ground, because to a man like him, the question was never what looked right, only what would still be standing when everything else failed. The first time people noticed, it was just a man hauling timber, where no one else would. A length of lodgepole dragged up a narrow cut in the slope, then another, then another. By the third day, it had a rhythm to it. Up the hill, down again, up the hill. Men standing outside Owen Bell's store began to watch without saying much at first. They had seen hard work before. That was not unusual. What was unusual was where it was going. Gideon Pike, the town's blacksmith, a man who had spent most of his life repairing what winter broke wagon runners, hinges, stoveplates leaned against the hitching rail, and followed Vance's path up the ridge with his eyes. He did not laugh, not right away, but he did speak. "You're putting that up there?" he called out one afternoon as Vance passed with another beam across his shoulder. Vance stopped, just long enough to shift the weight. "That's the plan." Gideon looked up the slope again, then back toward the valley, where the rest of Brass Hook sat close to the stream. "Wind'll hit you first up there," he said, "and it won't stop." Another man stepped in, shaking his head. "Snow stacks deeper on that side. You'll be digging your door out every morning." Owen Bell, the man who ran the general goods store, the place every family in Brass Hook depended on for flour, nails, lamp oil, and whatever else a winter might demand, spoke next, his voice calm, practical, the kind men trusted without thinking too hard. "And water's down here," he said, nodding toward the valley. "Every bucket you carry is uphill." There was a pause. Then someone said what the others had been thinking. "You're taking her up there too?" No one needed to explain who her was. Mara had been seen walking slower these days, careful with each step, one hand resting low against her side. Gideon exhaled through his nose. That's not a place for a woman in her condition when winter comes in. A few men nodded, not harshly, just certain. Vance listened. He did not defend the idea, did not raise his voice, did not try to convince anyone standing there. He shifted the beam again and started back up the slope. Behind him, the conversation picked up, low and steady. Not angry, not cruel, just settled, because in Brass Hook, a man could make his own choices. But the town would still decide what those choices meant. And as far as they could see, this one had already been decided. Vance did not build upward the way most men did. He built into the ground first. The hillside was cut back in a clean line, deeper than anyone expected, 5 feet, then more. By the time he stopped, the rear of the site had been driven nearly 5 feet and 8 inches into the slope, exposing packed soil layered with stone and gravel. Most men would have set posts and raised a floor. Vance set none. Instead, he laid stone, not loose, not shallow, each piece placed, fitted, and locked into a wall that ran thick, nearly 22 inches from face to back. Behind it, he packed broken rock, clay, and drainage gravel, sealing the earth in place like it had always been meant to hold something. When the wall was done, it did not look like part of a cabin. It looked like part of the hillside. Then came the frame. The first tamarack beam went up slow, cut heavy, shaved down to just under 10 inches across. Gideon saw it from below and let out a low breath. "That's not a roof beam," he muttered. "That's a bridge." The rest followed, each one set closer than usual, each one braced tighter than needed, at least by the standards Brass Hook had trusted for years. The front wall rose in peeled lodgepole, straight and functional, no wasted cuts, no ornament, and the roof low, sloped toward the valley, sat heavier than any cabin in town, not pitched to shed quickly, but built to carry what settled. People passing along the lower trail slowed without meaning to. They stood for a moment, watched, not because the structure was impressive, because it felt wrong, too buried, too heavy, too deliberate. It did not match anything they knew, and yet nothing about it looked careless. Every joint sat tight. Every line followed purpose, like it had been built for something that had not arrived yet. And that was what unsettled them most. Not that the cabin looked weak, but that it looked like it was waiting. It was enough to pull Gideon Pike up the slope. He did not come to argue. Not exactly. A man who had spent his life fixing what failed preferred to see things for himself before passing final judgment. He climbed steady, boots biting into the cut trail Vance had worn into the hillside, until the structure stood in front of him at full height. Up close, it looked even stranger. Not fragile, not foolish, just built for something no one else was preparing for. Vance was setting a brace when Gideon stepped into view. "You've put a lot into this," Gideon said. Vance nodded once. Gideon glanced past the cabin, up toward the higher ridge. Still doesn't answer why here. Vance didn't start with words. He walked a few steps beyond the frame and pointed. At first, Gideon saw nothing but trees and snow-dusted ground. Then, slowly, the line, a faint break, running across the slope above. Not sharp, not fresh, but there. Vance moved again, tapping the side of a trunk nearby. The tree didn't stand straight. It leaned subtle, but consistent with the others around it. "All grew that way," Vance said. Gideon followed the direction of the lean, downhill. Then Vance scraped his boot against the exposed ground near the cut. Beneath the topsoil, a layer of packed stone and old debris showed through. Not placed, carried, left there. "Not from here," Gideon said quietly. Vance shook his head. "No." He looked back up toward the ridge. "The slope doesn't stay still," he said. "It only waits." Gideon crossed his arms, eyes narrowing as he studied the mountain again. There had been winters, hard ones, but nothing that had done that. "Never seen it come down through the valley," he said. Vance didn't argue. Not yet. The word hung there longer than either man moved, because what it carried was simple, not doubt, not theory, just time. By the time the last beam was set and the roof sealed tight, the structure no longer looked like something built on the hillside. It looked like something pulled out of it. From the valley floor, most of it disappeared into the slope. Only the front wall, the low roof line, and a narrow thread of smoke rising from the chimney marked where it stood. Inside, the difference was immediate. The air did not move. No draft slipped through the seams. The stone at the back of the cabin held warmth long after the fire dropped to coals. It was quiet in a way the valley cabins were not. Heavy, stable, contained. But down below, the conversation had already ended. No one debated the idea anymore. They had named it. At first, it was just a passing remark outside Owen Bell's store. Then it settled into something more permanent. The Ridge Fool. The man who built uphill with a wife close to term and winter closing in. Others said it softer. That soldier who never came back right. Not loud, not cruel, just certain. Mara heard it once when she came down for supplies. A woman said it without lowering her voice. Mara didn't answer. She only took what she needed and walked back up the trail. Gideon never used the name, but he didn't stop it either. And once the name took hold, it did what names often do in places like that. It replaced the need to think. Winter arrived without force that year. Light snow, still air, no collapse, no failure. And slowly, the town let the whole thing drift out of mind. Because when nothing happens, people begin to believe they were right all along. That peace lasted until it didn't anymore. It started without urgency. Snow came down the first day in slow, steady layers. Nothing unusual. The kind men in Brass Hook had seen every year. The second day, it thickened. By the third, it changed. This was not the dry powder they were used to brushing from their sleeves. This snow carried weight. It clung to branches. It packed against walls. It held where it landed. By the fourth day, trees began to give way. Not all at once, one at a time. A sharp crack in the distance, then another. The sound carried through the valley in dull, echoing reports that no one could quite place. Fences disappeared first, then wagon wheels, then the lower halves of doors. Paths that had been cleared in the morning were gone again by afternoon. Men stopped walking between cabins. By the fifth day, even sound felt different. Muted, pressed down. The wind did not hold a direction. It shifted morning to midday to dusk, cutting across the valley in ways that unsettled men who had lived there long enough to trust patterns. Gideon stood once under the awning of his forge, looking up toward the ridgeline through the gray curtain of falling snow. He narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't sitting right. It wasn't just the weight. It was how it was laying. Too even in some places. Too thick in others, building in pockets where it shouldn't. He said nothing. Not yet, because men like him did not speak on instinct alone, but he watched longer than he needed to. Higher up, where the slope rose above the last line of cabins, the snow gathered without interruption. No paths cut through it. No footsteps disturbed it. No sound reached it. It simply built, layer on top of layer, heavy, wet, unmoving. In the valley, doors stayed shut. Fires burned longer. People waited for it to pass, the way they always had. But the storm did not feel like something passing through. It felt like something settling in. And up above Brass Hook, beyond where most men ever bothered to look, something was taking shape. Not fast, not loud, but certain. And then, just as steadily as it had come, the storm stopped. On the morning of the sixth day, the sky broke open in a pale, colorless light. The snowfall ceased as if cut off, leaving the valley buried in a depth no one had measured yet. For the first time in days, doors opened. Men stepped out first, boots sinking deep with each step. They stood still for a moment, taking in the quiet, then moved to check what had held and what had not. Roofs sagged under the weight, not collapsed but bowed. Some beams creaked when the wind brushed past them. Snow had sealed windows halfway up their frames. But the sky was clear, and that was enough. Children were the first to run. They broke paths where none existed, laughing as they fell into drifts that reached past their knees. Women followed more slowly, shaking snow from doorframes, sweeping what they could reach. Voices returned, low at first, then stronger. Because once the storm ends, people want to believe the danger ended with it. Gideon stepped out from his forge and looked upward, past the cabins, toward the ridge. The air was still, too still. He watched the slope for a long moment, then shifted his weight, uneasy in a way he couldn't yet explain. Something had changed, but nothing had moved. Halfway up the hillside, Vance Calder did not step outside. He stood just inside the door of his cabin, one hand resting against the frame, eyes fixed on the line above the ridge. The wind had dropped, the sky had cleared. But the snow was still there, sitting, waiting, holding its place on a slope that had not been touched. He did not need to see movement to understand what came next. And in that stillness, before the first sound, there was a truth the valley had not yet caught up to. This was not the end of the storm. It was the moment it decided what to do next. The sound came first. Low, deep, not sharp like a crack of timber or the snap of a branch under load. This was heavier. A drawn-out pressure, as if something beneath the surface had begun to shift and could no longer hold. Gideon Pike heard it before he understood it. He turned toward the ridge. At first, nothing moved. Then, a line. High above the valley, where the slope curved beneath the upper timber, a seam opened across the snowpack. It did not break clean. It stretched, slow and wide, like a tear running through cloth pulled too tight. Gideon's eyes locked onto it, and then the ground answered. The entire face of the mountain shifted, not falling, moving, a mass of snow, ice, and broken layers sliding as one body, gaining weight with every foot it traveled. Trees that had stood for decades disappeared into it. Others bent, snapped, and vanished beneath the advancing force. "Move!" Gideon shouted, voice cutting through the valley. But it was already too late for distance. The avalanche did not rush like water. It built, it gathered, and then it came. A wall of white and debris rolled downward, swallowing everything in its path. Cabins nearest the slope were the first to go. Roofs collapsed instantly under the impact. Walls folded inward, as if they had been made of nothing at all. Men ran. Women grabbed children without looking back. There was no path across, no way to outrun it on flat ground. Only one direction remained. Up. "Get to the ridge," Gideon shouted again, already moving. Boots drove into the snow, bodies pushed forward through drifts that had seemed harmless minutes before. The ground shook beneath them, a constant trembling that did not stop as the avalanche tore through the valley behind. A wagon lifted and turned. A roof disappeared. A chimney snapped and vanished into the white surge. Sound filled everything. Not one noise, but many. The grind of snow under pressure, the crack of timber giving way. The deep, rolling force of something too large to fight. People stumbled. Some fell. Others dragged them back up. There was no order, no plan, only movement, only survival. Gideon grabbed a boy by the arm, hauling him upright when his legs gave out. "Up!" he barked, pushing him forward again. Someone screamed a name that never came back. Another voice cut through the chaos. "The cabin." Gideon heard it. And in that instant, every word he had spoken weeks earlier came back to him not as argument, not as opinion, as weight. The ridge, the slope, the place no one built. He didn't hesitate. "Up the slope," he roared. "Keep climbing." Behind them, the avalanche reached the heart of Brass Hook. Everything that had been built close to comfort, close to water, close to what had always worked, was taken in seconds. The valley floor disappeared under a churning mass of white, broken wood, and buried lives. No house stood. No path remained. Only the upward trail, cut into the hillside by one man who had chosen ground no one else would trust. And as the last of them climbed through knee-deep snow, lungs burning, bodies failing, one truth settled in with the force of the mountain itself. There had never been time to argue, only time to be right. The climb took everything they had left. Snow dragged at their legs, heavy and unbroken, rising past the knees with each step. Every stride had to be forced. Every breath burned cold in the chest. No one spoke in full sentences anymore, only fragments. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Hold on." A child slipped. A woman caught him by the coat and pulled him forward without slowing. Another man stumbled and stayed down too long before hands dragged him back to his feet. Behind them, the sound did not fade. It rolled. It pressed. It followed. Gideon climbed with the others, but his mind was no longer on the ground beneath his feet. It was on the words he had spoken. "Wind'll hit you first up there. Snow stacks deeper. You're taking her into that?" Each one came back clear. Not as argument, as record. He pushed higher. The trail narrowed where Vance had cut it weeks before. A shallow path carved into the slope, just wide enough for one man at a time. Now it carried all of them, 31 souls, breathless, soaked, shaking, and then someone ahead stopped. Not because they were tired, because they had seen it. The cabin, half buried into the hillside, low against the ground, almost hidden except for the front wall and the steady thread of smoke rising from the chimney into the cold air. It had not moved. It had not shifted. It had not failed. "Go," Gideon urged, forcing the line forward again. They closed the last stretch in silence, the kind that comes when hope is too fragile to speak aloud. Before they reached the door, it opened. Light spilled out, warm against the gray. Vance Calder stood in the frame. No surprise in his face, no rush in his movement. He had been waiting. He looked at the crowd for a brief moment, took in what remained, then stepped back. Inside, no speech, no explanation, just space made where there had been none. They entered one by one. Snow fell from coats onto the floorboards. Hands shook as they reached for warmth. Children were passed forward without asking who would take them. Behind them, the sound of the valley finally began to settle. Not because it had ended, but because there was nothing left for it to take. Gideon stepped across the threshold last. For a moment, he didn't move. He stood just inside the door, looking at the structure he had once measured with doubt. The walls, the beams, the weight of it. Then he stepped in fully and pulled the door shut behind him. And in that simple act, the truth settled harder than anything the mountain had sent down. They were alive. Because of the place they had called a mistake. The door closed, and the difference was immediate. Sound dropped first. The wind that had filled their ears outside vanished, as if it had been cut away. What remained was the low crackle of fire and the uneven rhythm of breathing 31 people packed into a space built for two. It should have felt suffocating. It didn't. The air held, not still, in a way that choked, but contained. Warmth did not drift upward and disappear. It stayed low. It stayed where bodies were. Mara moved without speaking, guiding the first of them closer to the hearth, clearing space along the wall, pulling blankets from a chest, and handing them out with steady hands. No panic. No wasted motion. The stone behind the fire gave off heat that didn't flicker with the flame. It radiated slowly, evenly, like something that had been storing warmth long before they arrived. Gideon stood just inside the room, watching. He had built roofs, repaired them, watched them fail under less weight than what now pressed down on this one. He lifted his eyes. The beams ran thick across the ceiling tamarack, set close, each one braced into the structure behind it. No sag, no sound, not even the low complaint of wood under strain. He stepped forward, set his hand against one of the beams. Solid. He moved again, slower now, until he stood near the rear wall. The stone. He pressed his palm flat against it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't even close. It held warmth deep and steady despite the fire burning no higher than it needed to. Gideon left his hand there, longer than necessary. Then he pulled it back and looked at Vance. No question in his face now. No argument. Just understanding. Because this wasn't luck. It wasn't a storm that had missed its mark. It wasn't a structure that had survived by chance. Every part of it had been set for this. The depth in the ground, the weight in the beams, the stone holding heat instead of losing it. Gideon exhaled slowly. He had spent his life fixing things after they broke. Standing there, in that room, he realized he was looking at something built not to break at all. The cabin had done its job. It had stopped the cold from taking them in a single night. It had held against the wind. It had stood when everything below it had not. But survival had only changed shape. It had not ended. 31 people now filled the room. 31 bodies drawing heat. 31 mouths waiting for food. The stores had been built for two. Vance lifted the trapdoor, set into the floor, and descended a few steps into the lower space. Gideon followed. A lantern was lit, its glow catching along the shelves. Sacks lined the wall. Coarse cornmeal, dried peas, smoked venison, turnips packed in sand, enough for a season if it had remained just the two of them. Gideon counted without speaking at first. He had done this before, in different forms, not with food, with iron, with timber, with anything that ran out when misjudged. He looked up. "If we stretch it," he said quietly, "maybe 11 days. No one answered right away, because numbers like that did not need discussion. Above them, the room was still. The sound of movement had slowed. People understood more than they said. Vance nodded once. No argument, no false promise, just acceptance. Mara adjusted the fire above, feeding it small and steady, never letting it flare too high. Heat had to last. Everything had to last. Outside, the temperature had dropped further, far below zero, cold enough that exposed skin would fail in minutes. Inside, they had shelter, they had warmth, they had time, but not enough of it. And for the first time since they crossed that doorway, it became clear. They had survived the mountain. They had not yet survived the winter. By the second day, survival had taken on a rhythm. Not comfortable, not steady, but repeatable. People were assigned places along the walls where the heat held longest. Blankets were layered, not spread. Children were kept low, close to the stone. No space was left unused. Meals were stretched thin. Cornmeal boiled into a loose mash. Peas softened slowly in iron pots. Strips of venison cut smaller than any man would have accepted a week earlier. Snow was brought in by the bucket and melted in stages. Never too fast. Never wasted. Every action measured. Every movement controlled. Vance said little. He didn't need to. The system was already set. People followed it because anything outside it felt dangerous. And then someone stepped outside it. Eli Mercer, young and strong, had been watching the door since morning. He had energy left, too much of it. "We need more than this," he said under his breath. No one answered. He moved anyway, wrapped his coat tighter, grabbed a line, pulled the door open just enough to slip through. The cold hit him like a wall. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the wind shifted. It came across the slope without warning, cutting sideways, stronger than it had been the day before. Snow lifted off the surface in sheets, blinding, disorienting. Eli took 2 steps out, lost the trail, turned the wrong way. Inside, the door strained against its latch. Gideon was already moving. He grabbed the rope tied to the inner post and forced the door open against the pressure. The wind slammed it back hard enough to shake the frame. "Hold it," he barked. He stepped out into white. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the door ceased to exist. "Eli!" No answer. Then a shape low, stumbling, turning the wrong direction. Gideon lunged forward, caught him by the coat, and dragged him back by force. They hit the doorway together. Hands reached, pulled them inside. The door slammed shut. For a moment, no one spoke. Eli lay on the floor, breath tearing in his chest, face already losing color. Gideon didn't look at him. He looked at the room, at the people, at the door, and the lessons settled in without words. Out there, a single mistake was enough. In here, the margin for error was gone. They were not safe. They were surviving. And the difference between the two was thin as the door that barely held between them and the cold. By the 4th day, the shelves had begun to show it. Gaps. Not empty yet, but close enough that no one needed to say what it meant. 3 days. Maybe 4. That was what remained. Vance waited until the light held long enough to see without lantern, then moved toward the rear ladder. Gideon followed without asking. They climbed through the hatch and stepped out onto the roof. The cold cut sharper up there. Wind ran clean across the slope, unbroken. Vance didn't look at the ridge. He looked down. Gideon followed his gaze. At first, there was nothing but white. Then shapes. Not full structures, just angles breaking through the snow. Dark lines where roofs had not been completely buried. Fragments of the town. "Not everything is gone," Vance said. Gideon narrowed his eyes. Food, tools, anything sealed well enough might still be there. He nodded once. That was enough. They chose 5 men. Not the strongest, the ones who could move carefully. Rope was fixed to a standing tree above the slope. Knots checked. Lines set. One by one, they lowered themselves down. The surface was uneven, packed hard in places, hollow in others. Every step had to be tested before weight followed. It took time, more than it should have. When they reached the first exposed roof, Gideon struck through the top with the back of an axe. Wood splintered. Snow fell inward. They dug, down through debris, through packed layers, into what had once been a room. Inside, tin containers, still sealed, salt pork wrapped and stiff with cold, tools left where they had been dropped. Not much, but enough. They tied what they could carry and hauled it back up, inch by inch, hands burning through gloves. When they reached the cabin again, no one cheered. They didn't need to, because what came through that door wasn't just food, it was time, bought back from a place everyone else had already given up for lost. Winter did not end all at once. It loosened, slowly. The wind lost its edge first. Then the snow along the lower slopes began to soften, collapsing in on itself, turning from weight into water. Drips formed along the edges of the roof. Then lines. Then steady runs. One morning, the door opened, and the air no longer cut. People stepped outside carefully, as if the world might still break beneath them. The valley came into view in pieces, not as it had been. The outlines were wrong. Where rows of cabins once stood, there were only mounds, broken lines beneath melting snow, angles that did not match what had been built. Brass Hook had not survived. Its people had. They stood along the ridge in silence, looking down at what remained, not speaking of what was gone. There was work to do. When it began, it did not begin the way it had before. Foundations were not set at the lowest ground anymore. Men walked higher, tested soil, measured slope. Cabins rose with deeper cuts into the earth, walls built thicker, roofs set heavier, angles chosen with purpose, not habit. Some structures stood apart from the valley, entirely set along the lower rise of the slope, where wind could be read and weight could be managed. Not all followed, but enough did. Gideon stood one afternoon outside the Hillside cabin, looking at it the way he should have the first time. He did not touch it. He didn't need to. There was no name for it now, no laughter left to give, just understanding. Vance Calder was nearby, working as he always had. No speech, no claim laid to what had been proven. He didn't need it, because the mountain had already said everything that mattered, and what it had said was simple. The world does not keep what seems right. It keeps what stands. And when it comes time to choose, it does not ask who was loud, only who was ready. Do you think that Hillside cabin was a mistake, or something the others just couldn't see yet?